1, very quickly getting back up to where we were. Now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. This Herod is Herod Agrippa I, or Herod Agrippa I. He is the grandson of Herod the Great. Herod the Great, of course, was the one that killed the babies. You recall, in an attempt to get rid of Jesus. He was the nephew of Herod Antipas, who was the Herod that beheaded John. This Herod kills the brother of John, not John the Baptist, but John the son of Zebedee. It says in verse 2, "And he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword." Now, his history records, Eusebius records a little bit about this event and a little bit about what took place. As I understand it, the Jews generally beheaded individuals standing up. They did that on purpose. They did it because they wanted the head to fall to the ground. They wanted to get the show from this type of an action. It wasn't merely having him already laying on the ground and just chopping his head off. They wanted the full effect of that. They wanted to show that this person deserved to die in the worst kind of way. Now, we think about some of the events that have even taken place in recent days over in the Middle East, as some of our soldiers have been beheaded in much that same type of way. This goes back a long way in that part of the world in the way that they put individuals to death. Now, there were two major reasons why the Jews could decapitate someone. Neither one of these reasons applied in this case. They violated their own law in doing this. The first reason was communal apostasy, or idolatry. There was no idolatry involved in this case, but that was one of the ways, or one of the reasons for which someone could be beheaded. You can go back to the Old Testament and you can see that there were occasions, Agag, and you can think about the utterly destroying the Amalekites and others, that was the means that was employed on those situations. Maybe that's where they got their justification for this. There was another reason, and that was a willful murder. Not manslaughter, not accidentally killing someone, but if you deliberately took another life, then you could be put to death in this means or in this way. We know that they often put people to death by stoning, but this was another means that was employed by them in these two cases. But in this case, neither one of these things applied. It says in verse 3, "And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. These were the days of the unleavened bread." Now, a couple of things stand out right here. He saw that it pleased the Jews. Josephus and others record concerning Herod, this Herod, that he did a number of things to please people. He was an individual who sought that kind of acceptance, which probably says something about his low self-esteem or something else. But he really gave in to people and wanted people to flatter him and praise him. And we'll see that later on in the events of this very story and what happens to him. He kills James, and so seeing the reaction that he got from that, his thinking must have been, if they reacted this way over the death of James, how would they react if I could kill Peter? Peter's the vocal one. Peter is the one that always seems to be out in front. Peter is a leader among them and recognized even among them as a leader. And so if I could kill Peter, what would the reaction be? He was always looking for some kind of political benefit or favor, and so he seeks to do this. These were the days of the unleavened bread. Many suggest that's probably why there was some delay in killing Peter, is because he was waiting for these days to be accomplished before he carried out this action. In verse 4, "And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison, delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter, after Passover, to bring him forth to the people." And so we see something about the delay here and why he was delaying till the feast days were over. He's trying to get the people to be pleased with him. He doesn't want to do anything to displease them. And if he interrupts their feast or in some way desecrates their feast, then they're not going to be happy with him. And so he is required to delay just a little bit. But he doesn't want this delay to cost him this wonderful prisoner that he has. He has Peter in his grasp. He does not want Peter to get away. You may remember that there was an earlier occasion where the Jewish leaders had Peter in their grasp, and Peter did get away. And Herod is determined that's not going to happen this time. You can go back to Acts chapter 5 and see the boldness of Peter and see the arrest of Peter and what happened on that occasion. So Herod is determined that that's not going to happen this time. And so he has 16 soldiers that are guarding him. 16 soldiers. 4 teams of 4. As I understand it, they switch guard every 3 hours. And so there's constantly a new group of soldiers that are coming in and guarding him. They're in and out constantly as they watch him. He has him chained between 2 prisoners, which is to secure him even beyond the average. The average was to chain him to 1 soldier. That was sufficient. He was unarmed. He wasn't getting away from that 1 soldier. But again, the security that Herod has for Peter is 2 soldiers are going to be chained from him, and then these other soldiers are going to be standing guard at various positions to make sure that he does not get away. But he is going to get away, and we see that as we move down through this text. It says, Peter therefore was kept in prison. The word kept is an interesting word, and we many times point out that this word means to guard, a garrison. The idea is that something is heavily guarded. For example, when we get to 1 Peter, Peter's going to talk about how that we are kept by God, or literally we are guarded by God. God has His garrison about us. He is watching after us. And so that's the picture. And here's a pretty good illustration of that right here within this context of all these soldiers around Peter that have the responsibility of watching him. It says, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. I think the church understood, following the death of James, what Herod's intentions were. And they knew that Peter was on death row. They knew that it would not be long before the decision would be made concerning Peter, and Peter would be put to death. And although they're praying about it, they have their doubts. They're just human beings, just like we are. They're just men. If we knew that someone was on death row, and we knew that they were guarded by 16 soldiers, and we knew that they were under the control of a wicked man by the name of Herod, who had already killed someone and was determined to kill Peter, then our hope might be waning a little bit, and their hope was waning a little bit. They're still praying, that is to their credit. They evidently are praying in the early hours of the morning, and so they are either long at prayer or are getting up early to pray. Either way, it's commendable what they are doing. What were they praying for? Well, perhaps they were praying for Peter to have a painless death, as painless as it could be. They may have given into the fact that he's dead. Herod's going to carry this out. The clock is ticking. There's no stopping it now. That may have been their thinking, and they may have thought, at least let it go quickly. Let it be as painless as possible. It may be the case that they were praying that Peter's faith might not fail. That when Peter was put on before all these people and given the opportunity to deny, which was generally a part of these executions, to recant everything that you'd stood for or said, that Peter wouldn't do that. Now you remember that Jesus had so prayed for Peter, right? Jesus prayed that Peter's faith might not fail. It did fail, and that's an interesting thing, isn't it? That even Jesus can pray for us. Even Jesus can pray for our faith not to fail. But that's not going to keep it from failing. Why not? Well, because we have free will. And He's not going to override our free will. And He's praying that our faith might not fail, but ultimately it's up to us to make the right decisions, do the right things. And if we don't, it doesn't even matter if the Lord's praying for you. You're going to fail if you're not committed to Him. You're not committed to His will. It's not any reflection whatsoever on His sovereign power. Not at all. It is a reflection upon us and our free will and the realization that we have choices to make, and that when we make the wrong choices, there are consequences, eternal consequences that come to us as a result of that. And so the church was praying. They were praying unto God. They were praying for Him. A number of things stand out here. They were praying without ceasing. Day in and day out, they were uttering these prayers on His behalf. It says in verse 6, and when Peter would have brought him, or when Herod would have brought him forth, and that is bringing him forth for the purpose of execution, the same night Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains. The keepers before the door kept the prison. So we see this heavily guarded situation. It's the very night, probably the early morning hours before the execution is to take place. And so the next morning, when Herod will send for them to go get Peter to bring him out that he might execute him, The feast finally being to a point to where he can carry this out, Peter's not there anymore. Peter has escaped. Verse 7, and behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in prison. And he smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly, and his chains fell off of his hands. A couple of things stand out here. First of all, the angel of the Lord came upon him. Peter's between two soldiers. He's inside of a cell. He's heavily guarded. And yet, how does this angel get in there? He just came upon him. Have you ever been in a situation to where you were somewhere inside your house, you thought behind locked doors or whatever, and all of a sudden there was somebody? And the shock and the surprise of that. Perhaps we've all had that happen. We're out working in the yard, we're doing something, and all of a sudden there's a tap on the shoulder and we didn't even know there was anybody there. I remember one time when I was preaching in Alabama, the church building, very interesting, I don't know that this is biblical, but the church building didn't have any windows in it. I don't know that I've ever seen a church building have any windows in it. They had two side lights, if you can call those windows, just beside the double doors. But besides that, there were no windows at all. They built it to be as energy conservative as possible, to heat and cool it cheaper, no loss of any heating or cooling through any windows. So that's kind of the way it was built that way. But it was interesting because you felt like literally you were inside of a brick box. There was, once you closed the doors, locked the doors, you felt awfully secure because of that situation. I remember one day I was at my desk and I was studying, and all of a sudden I looked up and there was this big fella that was leaning over my desk. And he was, from the looks of him, he was homeless, had the big army jacket on and real rough beard and real rough hair. And I remember thinking, how did he get in here? Didn't hear him come in. Here he is. And so, survival instincts kind of kick in. And I don't know that he meant me any harm. I'm not trying to accuse him of that. I'm just suggesting it was a surprise and it was scary. And so I just reached instantly and grabbed my wallet. I pulled out some money. I think it was a $10 bill. And I just started walking toward the door with that $10 bill. Well, it was like a carrot before a horse, literally. And he just followed me. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. And here we go. And I opened the door. He walks out the door. I hand him the money and the door closes and that's it. I'm thinking the whole time, Jennifer's at work. It will be 5 or 6 o'clock this evening before she would even miss me. No one ever comes by the building. No one's going to check. And so if something happens, I'm not getting any help for a long time. And so all that's going through my mind, and I'm making decisions very quickly. Here is Peter, and Peter, all of a sudden the angel's there. The surprise of this, and there's a lot of surprise that's captured by Luke here. He came upon him, a light shined in prison. Isn't it interesting that God has a light wherever He needs a light? Any given moment, He could shine a spotlight on the situation. What a blessing light is. There's a spotlight. It's shining right on Peter, this type of situation. He smote Peter on the side. Peter's asleep. Peter can go to sleep because God doesn't sleep. The God that keeps us neither sleeps nor slumbers. And so Peter can confidently go to sleep. He does go to sleep. God is watching after him, and so he's able to do that. Psalm 121, verses 3 and 4. Most suggest this was probably between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, so it is very early in the morning. This is the time where at least many of us get that good sleep, right? It's the time where we've been asleep long enough to where we're really fast asleep. Peter was fast asleep. The angel had to smite him, had to tap on him to get him to wake up. It's interesting when you get down later on with the death of Herod, we're going to read that the angel smote him. Same exact word being used. The angel could smite somebody to wake them up, but he also could smite somebody to put them down. And that's what happened with Herod, is he killed Herod. Perhaps this same angel, if not another angel from the Lord. But one brought life and freedom, and the other one brought death and forever locking him in that situation. It says, he smote Peter on the side, raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly, and his chains fell off from his hands. Arise up quickly. There's urgency, and it's interesting. God's in control of this situation. If God's in control of this situation, what's the need for hurrying, right? But whenever God gets somebody up, whenever God calls somebody to get up, there's always an urgency to it. It's always arise, get up, and there's always an urgency to it. There was when Saul was told, now why tarriest thou? Arise. There's an urgency to it. God's business is always urgent business. God's business is never drag your feet business. God's business is never working for the state. That's not God's business. That's not the way God conducts His business. God doesn't say, well, we got as long as it takes to get this done. Let's do a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow, and let's make this job last as long as we can. That isn't the way God does His business. God's business is, here's a job that needs to be done. How quickly can we get it done and move on to another job? That's the way God conducts. God made the world in how many days? 6 days. God didn't waste any time making the world. He could have made it in one, of course. He had a reason for even using 6 days because He wanted that to be a pattern for their week. Their work week, work 6 days, rest the seventh day. But when God does something urgently. And when God tells us to do something, there's an urgency connected with it. If it's worth doing, if it needs to be done, then let's do it quickly. Let's get up and get about this business. That's true here. Rise up quickly. His chains fell off his hands. There are those who deny that there's anything miraculous in this context. That they try to give a naturalistic explanation to this. How did these chains just fall off? How did Peter go out of locked doors? How did the doors just automatically open? And I want to make a point about that in just a minute. Verse 8, the angel said unto him, gird thyself and bind on thy sandals. And so he did. Gird thyself. They generally wore an outer garment, but at night they would take that garment off, and that would be their blanket. That's what they would cover up with. And so it's true to culture of that day that he has to put this on. Bind on thy sandals. Most of us, when we go to bed, we take our shoes off. And that was true even if you're sleeping on a prison floor. You would take your shoes off, so put on your sandals, and so he did. Now, all those details could be left out, right? But inspiration sees fit to include them, which there are a number of things about this that are very interesting because the Holy Spirit takes time to include some details to show the historicity of what is being recorded here and the accuracy of what's being recorded. He saith unto him, cast thy garment about thee and follow me. And he went out and followed him, and wist not that it was true which was done by the angel, but thought he saw a vision. Now remember, if this is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, and somebody shakes you up, are you wide awake immediately? No. There are times, no doubt, when many of you have gotten up to take care of a child in the middle of the night. You got up and you did what you had to do, and then you got back in the bed, and it just kind of went through the motions. You're not fully awake. You're trying not to be fully awake. Because you want to go back to sleep, and so you're just trying to get this done. That's the kind of situation right here. He's been in a deep sleep. He's up. He doesn't fully understand. Is this really happening? Is this a dream? Have you ever done that? Have you ever thought, well, is that a dream? Or is that really? Or did that happen? It can seem so real even if it isn't. So that's the kind of idea, again, being captured here by inspiration. It says in verse 10, when they were past the first and the second ward, they came into the iron gate that leadeth into the city, which opened to them of his own accord. Now, automatic doors, they're not too impressive to us. If small children sometimes walk up to a door and the doors just automatically open, but after a while, the newness of that, how amazing that is, just kind of wears off. We don't think anything about it. We go in and out of the grocery store, we go in and out of Walmart, whatever, and the doors just open up for us. We don't think anything about it. Put yourself in a first century context. Here's an iron gate. You walk up to that gate, and the Greek here literally is automatically. Here's an automatic door. Long before automatic doors. But it just opened automatically. Now that would be impressive. That would be something that would just be shocking to him. And in that context and in that world, that's exactly what happened. The door just opened automatically. And they went out and passed on through one street, and forthwith the angel departed from him. Now the angel says, follow me. But they get out into the open street, and the angel disappears. Follow me. We've said before the idea of the divine economy. The idea of the divine economy is God never does for man what man can do for himself. There are a number of examples of that in the Scriptures. We talked about Lazarus in his tomb, the stones there. Jesus tells them to roll away the stone. Could Jesus not have rolled away the stone? Could Jesus not have just done that and the stone rolled back and forth at His command? He could have said something, it would have rolled away, but He tells them to do it. Why does He tell them to do it? God never does for man what man can do for himself. They're capable of rolling away that stone. He expects them to do that. He's going to do what they can't do. He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. They can't do that, but they can roll away the stone. Remember in the Old Testament, the manna. They can't make bread fall from heaven. Only God can do that, and so God does that. But they're capable of going out and gathering it up. It doesn't fall directly on their tables. They have something to do. You know, we think about work. Work from the beginning of time was commanded of man. Even in the garden where everything was provided there was work. Now, the toil and the sweat of one's brow and fighting against the thorns and the thistles, that comes as a result of sin. The pain of childbirth comes as a result of sin. We know what Genesis teaches us about that. But work itself is not a curse. Work has always been for man's good. And even though God sent bread from heaven, there was something they could do, something that they were expected to do. Now think about this right here. Think about this angel leading Peter out. And this angel leads Peter out past the guards, past the iron gate. Peter couldn't open that gate of his own accord. That's beyond Peter's ability to do that. This is a city gate. It's locked. It's locked for a reason. You're not getting out of this gate or in this gate until morning for the protection. But it opens automatically because the angel's with Peter. But as soon as Peter gets in the street where Peter has the freedom to move about, the angel disappears from him. Does Peter know what to do? Absolutely. He knows where to go, right? He knows where the brethren meet. He knows where the church meets in this town. He knows where they will be. He knows where he can go. He doesn't need the angel to lead him anymore. He's capable of doing this now on his own. Now, the idea is this. The idea is God will help us to a point, but God's not going to do it for us. God will lead us, but at some point we've got to take responsibility for our own actions. We're capable of it. We're expected to do it. We have to do it. We talked about in the Old Testament that the day came that the manna ceased. They were fed with manna up until the time that they came into the Promised Land. But when they came into the Promised Land, what happened to the manna? Went away. They didn't need manna anymore. They now had a land flowing with milk and honey. God had brought them to the land. They now could provide for themselves. They were expected to provide for themselves. Same kind of idea right here. The angel helps Peter until Peter doesn't need the help anymore, and then the angel disappears. Peter's on his own. Verse 11, and when Peter was come to himself, notice that language. We talked about that in the parable of the prodigal son, right? He came to himself. And the idea is thinking soberly. The idea is being fully awake. Peter's not been fully awake up to this point. Peter's been stumbling through the streets. He's got somebody leading him. He's just following. But now, when the angel disappears from him, now Peter's got to do his own thinking. Peter's now got to decide, okay, where do I go now? I don't have anybody to follow anymore. Do I go left? Do I go right? Where do I go? What do I do? He's got to be awake. He's got to come to himself. And that's what he does. And that we think about the prodigal son in that parable. There may very well have been that time in that parable where the prodigal son simply following other people. There are other people going to the far country. Perhaps he had friends that were going there. Perhaps that's why he made the request he did. They also hadn't made those requests. He's going to the far country. He didn't have to give a lot of thought to it. But the day came when he had to give thought, what am I going to do? Am I going to stay right here where I am? My friends have left me. I don't have anybody. What am I going to do? Where am I going? He had to come to himself, make that decision. That's true right here of Peter. He comes to himself. He's fully awake. He's deciding what he needs to do. It says, now I know of a surety that the Lord hath sent his angel and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. Peter's had time to think about it. And as he began, now this is what logic is. This is what reasoning is. We put two and two together and reach a conclusion. Peter thinks, I know I was in prison. I know I was in jail. I remember being chained to 2 soldiers. I remember all the soldiers at the door. I remember the hours. I remember how everything changed in and out. I remember all of that. I didn't think all that up. That's really happened. All of a sudden, I felt somebody pushing on me. The chains fell off my hands. The doors opened. Even the city gate opened automatically. God's doing this. It's the only way I can account for all of this. Now think about the reasoning that's involved in that. Faith is reasonable, isn't it? Peter comes to believe that God is doing this. Does he have a foundation for that belief? He simply starts adding things up. How else do I account for this other than the fact that God's done this? We're expected to do the same thing on even a larger scale with the world, right? This world is here. It shows design. It's just the right distance from the sun. Any closer to burn up, any further away to freeze. We just think about all of that. We begin to add 2 and 2 and 2. The only logical, only reasonable answer to that is somebody had to make this. Somebody had to do this. Who was it? It's God. Peter arrives at that too. A small illustration of that bigger reasoning that we have to do as far as this world. It says, he came to himself. Now I know of a surety that the Lord had sent His angel. And notice the emphasis, His angel. Later on, the people that are meeting in John Mark's house are going to think, it's not Peter, it's probably his angel. Here's God's angel. God does have an angel. In fact, He has angels. He has an angelic host that serve Him. We'll talk about whether or not we do in just a minute. Hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod. He was in the hand of Herod. Herod was preparing to execute him. And from all the expectation of the people of the Jews, there is a lot of expectation. James has been killed. Now Herod has Peter. The expectation is Peter is about to be killed. That's the expectation. But God delivered him from that expectation of all the people. Verse 12, and when he had considered the thing, notice the reasoning. He's thinking about this. He's meditating on this. The Bible talks about, Psalm 1's an example of this, it delights in the law of the Lord, and in His law doth he meditate day and night. Think about the way that God gave us the Bible. God has revealed things to us. God has revealed things that if we really want to grasp them, to get them, to understand them, then we have to do some thinking. We have to do some meditating. Could God not have just made it so painfully obvious that we didn't have to give it any thought? But God didn't create us that way. God created us to be beings that think, that reason, that make decisions. And so it is here. We're beings that think, we reason, we make decisions. We have to think about things and meditate on things. And that's what He's doing. He's considered the thing. He came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark. Later on in 1 Peter, we're going to come to the conclusion that Mark had been converted by Peter. He had a connection to this family, evidently a very close connection to this family, because Mark later on is going to appear in 1 Peter as someone very closely connected with Peter, someone also connected with Paul. We see some overlapping between Peter and Paul. The reins are shifting from Peter to Paul. We're going from Peter's work in the book of Acts to Paul's work in the book of Acts, but there's some connections between the two, and Mark is one of those connections. They're meeting in the house of Mary, the mother of John. The church is meeting in her house, which suggests that she must have been a woman of some means. She had a place big enough for the church to be able to meet in her house. Let's think about this congregation. Not calling attention to anyone, but there are some people within this congregation who have a home big enough where the church could meet in their home if they needed to. There are others that don't have a home that would allow them to do that. Now, that was true of the early church as well. Some had homes big enough to accommodate the church, others did not. She did. There evidently was a courtyard connected with her house because there's an outer gate, and Peter's going to knock on that outer gate. He isn't able to walk merely into the house. And that again shows the kind of wealth that probably was involved in this family. And so there were those in the early church who were people of some means. It says, where many were gathered together praying. They're gathered together. They're gathered together for the purpose of prayer. This is a prayer meeting. We used to call gospel meetings prayer meetings. They're meeting for the purpose of prayer. Verse 13, as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken named Rhoda. The name Rhoda means rose. She hears the knock. She comes to see. This is early in the morning again. Verse 14, and when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness. She couldn't see who it was, but she knew the voice. She knew it was Peter's voice. She was extremely excited, which suggests that she was a friend of Peter as well, knew Peter well, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. She doesn't open the gate. She doesn't let Peter in. But she does go and deliver the news. Verse 15, and they said unto her, thou art mad. You're crazy. But she constantly affirmed, she kept on saying that it was even so. Then said they, it is his angel. Now the Jews commonly believed that individuals each had an angel. Personal angel that looked after them, that guarded them. That does not mean it was so. It just meant it was a belief that they had. They had other beliefs that were not so. Luke simply recording that they had this belief. Verse 16, and they're looking for some way to account for this other than it being Peter. They just can't fathom the fact that it's Peter, so they're looking for another explanation. Verse 16, but Peter continued knocking. Think about Peter. Peter wants inside. He's out here knocking. He's in a very difficult situation. When they had opened the door, she saw him, and they saw him, and they were astonished. Verse 17, but he beckoning unto them with a hand to hold their peace. Evidently, they were being rather loud. They're excited. But it's early in the morning. Peter's like, don't be so loud. Here are people asleep, including Herod and all of his guards. They're asleep. Don't be real loud here. Well, let's be quiet. He declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison, and he said, go show these things unto James. It's interesting how many times in the gospel, when the good news comes, they're told, you go tell somebody this good news. Remember when Jesus was raised from the dead? They were told, go tell the disciples and Peter. Make sure Peter knows this. Here it is. Go tell them and James. Make sure that James knows this. This is a half-brother of the Lord, and to the brethren. And he departed and went into another place. Now, as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers what was become of Peter. Here's their prized prisoner. He's gone. When Herod had sought for him, intending to execute him, found him not, he examined the keepers and commanded that they should be put to death. That was the penalty of letting a prisoner escape. It's interesting, isn't it, that there was another notable prisoner who escaped. That prisoner's name, of course, was Jesus. He'd been put to death and placed in the tomb. That tomb was guarded, and that prisoner escaped, didn't he? Those guards were not put to death. Calls to mind why. Why were they not put to death? Instead of being put to death for letting him get away, they were actually paid. What's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is the Jewish leaders knew full well what had happened to Jesus. There's no any question in their minds. There's a quote in the bulletin this last week that the disciples, as far as we know, after Mary, didn't return to the tomb of Jesus. There was no reason to. They knew he wasn't there. But perhaps the enemies never returned to his tomb because they were afraid that they would find that he was not there. They didn't want to face that. And so the Jews do not have these soldiers put to death. They know what's happened to Jesus. No arguing that. He went down from Judea to Caesarea. Herod gets out of town. This is bad for business. Here's your notable prisoner. You got all this planned. Everybody's expecting, and all of a sudden he's nowhere. You leave your cronies behind to kind of explain what's going on. But you get out of town. You don't want to deal with this. Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon. He's probably not in a good mood, and he wasn't in a good mood with them, but they came with one accord to him, and having made Blastus the king's chamberlain their friend, evidently they got Blastus to intercede on their behalf. Herod cut them off. They were in dire straits. They desired peace because their country was nourished by the king's country, and the king wasn't nourishing them anymore. And so they've got to try to make peace. It came, and upon a set day, many believe August the 1st, the Caesar's birthday, upon a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, Josephus says it was a garment made of silver, extremely bright and shining in the morning sun, sat upon his throne, made an oration of them. The oration here literally means Herod went on and on. It was not a short speech. It was a long, long speech. And the people gave a shout, saying, "It is the voice of a god and not of man." It does not necessarily mean that they thought Herod was a god. He's glistening in the sun. But remember, they want to be nourished by him. So it's in their favor to really build him up, to get benefits from him. That's evidently what they're doing. He's more than glad to let them do it. The people gave a shout, and immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory. He didn't say, "Oh no, don't do this, don't worship me, I'm not a god." He didn't do that. He was receiving it in. He was eaten of worms, gave up the ghost. Most believe that this has something to do with tapeworms, probably cysts that were inside of him. And one of those cysts ruptured, and literally worms from that cyst went everywhere. Josephus says within 5 days he died an extremely painful death, eaten of worms. A very, very gross kind of way to die. But it was deserved. He didn't give God the glory. He killed God's messengers, and he ultimately is going to pay the price. Be sure your sin will find you out. Verse 24, the word of God grew and multiplied. And God's word keeps on growing even though Herod is removed. Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and took with them John, whose surname was Mark. And so we see Barnabas and Saul. We see the changing over here. And there's some overlapping, though, with John Mark. Thank you for your attention this morning.